could a disease wipe out entire generations, leaving behind a world altered beyond recognition? What if the very people who held the village's memories, its wisdom, its family stories, were the first to fade? This was the chilling reality of the Black Death, striking Europe from 1347 to 1351. Number 1. Increased rateability to disease. The arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century brought an unseen terror to every corner of Europe. It was a time when understanding of medicine was rudimentary, and the true nature of contagion was a mystery. When the plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, swept through communities, it did not spare anyone, but it certainly did not treat all ages equally. The elderly population faced a unique and often more brutal encounter with this deadly sickness. Their bodies, having weathered decades of life, were simply not as robust as those of the young. A medieval elder, perhaps 60 or 70 years old, would have already endured a lifetime of physical challenges. They might have lived through periods of famine, battled various fevers, recovered from injuries sustained during manual labor, and faced the natural decline that comes with aging. These previous encounters with illness, though survived, often left the body with lasting marks, weakening the immune system over time. Scholarly texts from later periods, analyzing the demographics of plague victims, suggest a clear pattern. Parish burial records, where they survived the upheaval at an elevated mortality rate among older individuals. This pattern is not just a modern guess. It is based on the limited but telling data that historians have painstakingly pieced together from fragmented church registers and wills. An older person's immune system, even without a specific medical diagnosis, would have been less efficient at recognizing and combating a novel and aggressive pathogen like Yersinia pestis. The body's defenses, like a well-worn shield, offered less protection against such a relentless attacker. When the plague bacillus entered an older body, perhaps through a flea bite, it likely found less resistance, allowing it to multiply rapidly and overwhelm the system faster than in a younger, more resilient individual. Many older individuals in medieval society would have already been living with chronic conditions that were common for the time, yet largely untreatable. Joint pain from years of farming or crafting, weakened lungs from exposure to smoke and damp living conditions, or failing hearts from the strain of a physically demanding life were all common ailments. These underlying health issues, even if not immediately life-threatening on their own, created a precarious state of health. A body already struggling with a persistent cough, chronic aches, or a tired heart would find it exceptionally difficult to mount a robust defense against a sudden violent infection like the plague. It was like fighting a battle when already wounded. The plague would often exploit these existing vulnerabilities, turning a chronic discomfort into a fatal flaw. The symptoms of the bubonic plague itself were horrifying. Swollen, painful lymph nodes called buboes, fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, and extreme weakness. For an older person, whose body temperature regulation might already be less efficient, or whose digestive system was more sensitive, these symptoms would have been even more debilitating. The sheer physical toll of the fever alone could push an already frail body past its breaking point. Dehydration, a common consequence of high fever and vomiting, would have set in faster and been more dangerous for someone whose bodily reserves were already low. The severe fatigue accompanying the plague would have left older individuals bedridden, unable to care for themselves even in the most basic ways. Their vulnerability was not just to the disease itself, but to the cascade of physical deterioration it triggered. Archaeological evidence, though not always conclusive on specific causes of death, can provide context. Mass burial sites, often hastily dug during the plague years, sometimes reveal skeletal remains that show signs of age-related wear and tear. While it is impossible to say definitively that every older skeleton found died of the plague, The sheer volume of bodies from the plague period, across all age groups, but with a notable presence of the aged, reinforces the idea of widespread mortality. The absence of specific medical interventions further amplified this vulnerability. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory, and certainly no intensive care for the critically ill. Medical practitioners of the time relied on remedies like bloodletting or herbal concoctions, which were largely ineffective against the plague and could even weaken an already compromised patient. For the elderly, these interventions were often too little, too late, or simply counterproductive. The very nature of their immune response might have contributed to their heightened risk. As humans age, the immune system undergoes a process known as immunosenescence, where its ability to produce new antibodies and react quickly to novel threats diminishes. While medieval people certainly did not have this scientific understanding, the observable fact was that the elderly seemed to succumb more readily. They had seen many winters, but this particular winter of disease was different. The plague spread with a ferocity that defied all previous experience, and the bodies of the old, having already fought so many battles over their long lives, found themselves facing an enemy unlike any they had ever encountered. The battle was often lost, quickly leaving behind a stark demographic reality that would shape the future of society. Number 2. Loss of caregivers and support networks. When the Black Death arrived in a village or town, it did not just bring disease. It brought chaos and disruption to the very foundations of daily life. For medieval elders, who often relied heavily on their families and wider community for support, this disruption was especially devastating. In an era before organized social welfare systems or widespread medical facilities, the family unit was the primary safety net. Children and grandchildren provided essential care for their aging parents and grandparents. They fetched water from the well, gathered firewood, prepared meals, cleaned their homes, and assisted with personal needs. For an older person perhaps suffering from the natural frailties of age, like poor eyesight or limited mobility, these daily tasks were impossible without assistance. The plague, however, struck down individuals indiscriminately, often taking the young and healthy as readily as the old and infirm. It was a common occurrence for entire families to fall ill within days, or even hours, of each other. A young, strong son who normally tilled the fields and supported his aging parents might succumb to the illness, leaving his parents with no one to bring in food or tend to their needs. A daughter who had taken on the role of carer for her ailing mother might herself become feverish and die, leaving her mother isolated and helpless. This sudden and widespread loss of caregivers meant that many elders were left completely abandoned, not out of malice, but because their usual providers were either dead, dying, or too ill themselves to offer aid. Contemporary accounts from chroniclers and observers during the plague years frequently describe this breakdown of family structures. One particularly grim passage might speak of a mother and daughter dying in the same bed with no one left to even close their eyes or arrange for their burial. Such scenes were not rare exceptions, but a common tragedy. For the elderly, this meant that even if they initially avoided infection, their survival became precarious, simply due to the lack of basic care. A bedridden elder, who could not rise to get a drink of water or relieve themselves, would face a slow and agonizing decline, not necessarily from the plague itself, but from dehydration, starvation, or neglect. As the death toll mounted and people saw their neighbors and loved ones falling ill, a chilling panic often set in. Healthy individuals, desperate to avoid infection, might flee their homes and communities, leaving behind those who were too old or too weak to travel. Imagine a small cottage where an elderly woman, perhaps a widow, lived with her surviving children and grandchildren. They were her world, her support. Then the plague arrived. One by one, her robust son, her busy daughter-in-law, her playful grandchildren, might fall ill. Perhaps the youngest child is taken first, then the next. Soon, the able-bodied members of the household are too weak to move, or they have died. The old woman, perhaps still free of the plague herself, finds herself surrounded by sickness and death, with no one to fetch her water, no one to light the fire, no one to bring her food. This was not a hypothetical scenario. It was a grim reality for countless elderly people across Europe. The very networks designed to sustain them in their final years evaporated with terrifying speed. Beyond the immediate family, the wider community support system also dissolved. Neighbors who in normal times would have offered help in times of need were either too busy mourning their own dead, too ill to assist, or too afraid to approach infected households. The communal bonds that held medieval society together, built on reciprocal aid and shared burdens, fractured under the immense pressure of the pandemic. Almshouses, hospices, and other charitable institutions that sometimes provided refuge for the elderly poor were quickly overwhelmed, their staff dying, their resources depleted. The very places meant to offer solace became hotspots of contagion, often turning into death traps rather than havens. The profound sense of isolation that must have settled upon these abandoned elders is almost unimaginable. To witness the sudden disappearance of everyone you knew, everyone who cared for you, everyone who was supposed to be your future, would have been a psychological torment far beyond physical suffering. Even if they survived the initial onslaught of the plague, their remaining days would have been spent in a desolate world, stripped bare of human connection and practical support. The loss of caregivers was not just a personal tragedy. It was a societal wound that left its most vulnerable members exposed and defenseless against the pervasive shadow of death. Number 3. Nutritional deficiencies. The Black Death did not just kill people. It profoundly disrupted the entire economic and agricultural fabric of medieval society, leading directly to widespread nutritional deficiencies. For the elderly, who often had more specialized dietary needs or were less capable of finding their own food, this breakdown in food supply was a critical factor in their disproportionate suffering. Medieval life was, for the vast majority, subsistence living. Most people lived in rural areas, directly connected to the land. Food production relied heavily on human labor, from plowing fields and sowing seeds to harvesting crops and tending livestock. When the plague struck, it decimated the labor force with terrifying speed. Villages lost half, two-thirds, or even more of their inhabitants. Fields lay fallow because there were simply not enough hands to work them. Crops rotted in the ground because there was no one to bring in the harvest. Livestock wandered untended or starved because shepherds and farmers had died. This immediate and drastic reduction in agricultural output had dire consequences for food availability. Even if a particular village was not immediately hit by the plague, the disruption in neighboring areas or along trade routes meant that grain, vegetables, and meat became scarce and expensive. For medieval elders, especially those who were no longer strong enough to work the land themselves, their food security depended entirely on their family members or unstable market conditions. With young, strong laborers dying, the ability of families to produce or procure food diminished drastically. If their sons and daughters, who were the primary breadwinners and farmhands, succumbed to the plague, the elderly were left without access to the food supplies they needed. They could not go out to gather wild foods, hunt, or travel to distant markets, even if such markets were still functioning. Their physical limitations meant they were reliant on others to bring food to them. Even if food was available in limited quantities, the economic upheaval caused massive inflation. Prices for essential foodstuffs skyrocketed, making them unaffordable for many, especially the elderly who might have little to no income of their own. A small pension, if they were lucky enough to have one from a lord or a monastery, might become worthless in the face of runaway prices. The competition for dwindling resources also often disadvantaged the elderly. In a desperate struggle for survival, those who were physically stronger and more capable of active foraging or bartering would inevitably fare better. The elderly, with their limited mobility and declining physical strength, would often be at the back of the queue, literally and figuratively. For scarce food, the quality of food also declined. People ate what they could find, often less nutritious or more difficult to digest foods. For an older person, whose digestive system might already be more delicate, or whose body required specific nutrients to maintain health, this degradation in diet was particularly harmful. A diet lacking in essential vitamins and minerals would further weaken their immune system, making them even more susceptible to the plague if it did eventually reach them, and less able to recover from other common medieval ailments. Chronic malnutrition would have left them vulnerable to other opportunistic infections, compounding their suffering. Historical accounts from the period, though not always focusing on individual nutritional status, frequently mention the scarcity of food following the plague. Chronicles speak of fields lying unworked, of famine preceding or following the plague in some regions, and of the general hardship faced by the survivors. While the immediate cause of death was the plague itself, the weakened state of those who were malnourished would have made them easier targets for the disease. It was a vicious cycle. The plague killed workers, leading to food shortages, which in turn weakened the population, making them more vulnerable to the plague. For the elderly, this cycle was especially perilous, trapping them in a slow decline even if the plague spared them initially. Their struggle for basic sustenance became a daily battle, often unwinnable, in a world stripped bare of its usual bounty. Number 4. Psychological trauma and grief. The Black Death was not merely a physical illness, it was a profound psychological catastrophe, inflicting unimaginable trauma and grief on those who survived. For medieval elders, who had already lived long lives and accumulated deep connections within their communities, the scale of death they witnessed was uniquely devastating. They had seen many seasons pass, many harvests, many births and deaths, but nothing could have prepared them for the sheer relentless tide of mortality that swept across Europe. They watched their world unravel before their eyes. Imagine an elder who had spent decades living in the same village. They knew every family, every house, every face. They had seen their children grow, marry, and have children of their own. Their identity was deeply interwoven with the fabric of their community. Then the plague arrived within weeks, sometimes even days. Familiar faces vanished. Friends with whom they had shared stories, neighbors with whom they had worked the land, shopkeepers from whom they had bought their goods, all were gone. The sheer volume of death meant that traditional burial rites often broke down. Bodies piled up in carts, or were simply left unburied, or hastily interred in mass graves without the proper prayers and rituals that were so vital to medieval people. This desecration of sacred customs would have added another layer of horror to their grief. The most profound trauma for many elders would have been the loss of their own children and grandchildren. A parent expects to die before their offspring. To witness their healthy, vibrant children and grandchildren succumb to a swift and brutal illness would have been a torment beyond measure. The future of their family line, their very legacy, was extinguished before their eyes. They might have held their dying son in their arms, only to lose him. They might have watched their daughter, their Kerlar, grow weak and then simply stop breathing. They might have seen their grandchildren, the hope of the next generation, fall silent. The pain of such losses, multiplied many times over, would have been an unbearable burden. This was not a single bereavement, but a cascading wave of grief, leaving them with no time to process one loss before another struck. Survivors' guilt would have been a heavy shadow. Why them? Why did they, the old, remain, while the young and strong were taken? Such questions, framed within a medieval religious context, would have been profoundly disturbing. Was it divine punishment? Had they somehow offended God? The spiritual anxiety combined with the raw agony of loss would have created a crushing psychological weight. The world they knew, the social order they understood, had been shattered. All the familiar rhythms of life, the church bells, the market chatter, the sounds of children playing, were replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the cries of the sick or the lamentations of the dying. The constant fear of contagion also contributed to their trauma. Every cough, every sneeze, every feverish flush on a loved one's face would have brought a fresh wave of terror. The knowledge that death was always lurking, that it could strike them or their remaining loved ones at any moment, created an atmosphere of pervasive dread. Even if they were physically resilient, the emotional strain of living through such a period of sustained horror would have been immense. Chroniclers often spoke of people dying from despair or fear, a testament to the psychological toll the plague exacted. For the elderly, who had lived the longest and seen the most, the memories of what they had witnessed would have haunted their remaining days. The world was transformed into a landscape of graves and empty homes, and they were among the few remaining witnesses to its devastation. The psychological scars of the Black Death would have been etched deeply into their souls, a silent, enduring testament to the unprecedented tragedy they endured. Number 5. Economic ruin and poverty. The Black Death plunged medieval society into an economic crisis, unlike any it had ever faced, and this had particularly dire consequences for the elderly, often pushing them into extreme poverty. Medieval economies were fundamentally agrarian, reliant on human labor to produce food and goods. When the plague wiped out vast swaths of the population, it annihilated the labor force, causing wages to skyrocket for the survivors but simultaneously disrupting all traditional means of earning and saving. For older individuals whose ability to work and earn was already diminished by age, this economic upheaval was catastrophic. Many elders in medieval society were dependent on their working family members for financial support. Sons and daughters, as farmers, artisans, or laborers, brought in the income or produced the food that sustained the entire household, including their aging parents and grandparents. When these working-age family members died en masse, the elders were suddenly left without any means of sustenance. Their primary source of income or sustenance vanished overnight. A widow whose only son supported her through his blacksmithing might find herself destitute when he succumbed to the plague. An elderly couple living on a small plot of land worked by their robust grandsons would face starvation if those grandsons perished. The traditional intergenerational contract, where the young cared for the old, was broken by death. Even if an elder owned land, its value could plummet dramatically after the plague. With so few laborers left, there was no one to work the fields. A landowner might have vast acres, but without tenants or hired hands, the land became unproductive. Crops could not be planted, harvested, or brought to market. This meant that the land, which was usually a source of wealth, or at least sustenance, became a burden. Selling it was difficult because there were few buyers, and those who could afford to buy land might prefer to use their resources to acquire labor or other necessities. For elders relying on rents or a share of the produce from their land, this income stream dried up, leaving them with assets that could not provide for their daily needs. Savings for those few who had them might also become worthless. The economic instability caused by the plague led to wild fluctuations in prices, and in some cases, currency devaluation. What little coin an elder had tucked away might buy far less food or goods than before, or be impossible to exchange in a disrupted market. There were no banks in the modern sense, and wealth was often tied up in land, livestock, or family labor, all of which were severely impacted by the demographic collapse. The concept of retirement with a steady income was rare, limited primarily to high-ranking clergy or nobility. For the common person, old age almost invariably meant reliance on kin. The impact of the labor shortage meant that while wages for surviving workers increased, this benefit rarely reached the elderly directly. They were often beyond the age of being able to command high wages, and if they were too frail to work, they gained nothing from the newfound value of labor. Instead, they faced skyrocketing prices for food and services, making their limited resources, if any, stretch even less far. The breakdown of social order also meant that what little charitable support existed from monasteries or wealthy individuals often ceased. Monasteries themselves were decimated by the plague, their treasuries depleted and their monks dying. The wealthy, if they survived, were often preoccupied with managing their own estates and preventing their own ruin. The result was widespread destitution among the elderly. They were left to fend for themselves in a world where food was scarce, prices were high, and their support networks had vanished. Many would have faced slow starvation, forced to beg, or simply succumbed to hunger and disease in their isolated homes. The economic ruin brought by the Black Death did not just affect grand lords or merchants. It stripped away the last vestiges of security from the most vulnerable members of society, leaving them in a profound state of poverty and hopelessness. Number 6. Disruption of traditional knowledge transfer. Medieval society was built upon generations of accumulated knowledge, much of which was passed down orally through demonstration and by direct teaching within families and communities. Elders served as the living encyclopedias of their time, repositories of practical skills, historical memory, and cultural wisdom. The Black Death, by disproportionately affecting and often eliminating this older generation, created a profound and irreplaceable loss of traditional knowledge. This disruption had far-reaching consequences for the practical functioning of society and the preservation of its collective identity. Consider the intricate knowledge required for farming in the medieval period. This was not simply a matter of plowing and sowing. It involved centuries of accumulated wisdom about soil rotation, recognizing weather patterns, timing of planting and harvesting specific crops, managing livestock diseases, and repairing tools. An experienced elder, perhaps a seasoned farmer or a village elder, would have carried this knowledge in their head, having learned it from their own parents and grandparents. They knew the signs for a good harvest, the proper way to mend a broken plow, the right time to shear sheep, or how to treat an ailing cow with traditional remedies. When these elders died, this invaluable practical expertise often perished with them. The younger, surviving generations, if they were lucky enough to still be alive, might have rudimentary skills but lacked the deep, nuanced understanding that only came with decades of experience. This loss could lead to less sufficient farming practices, reduced yields, and greater vulnerability to environmental challenges, directly impacting food security for years to come. Beyond agriculture, elders were also the custodians of many other vital skills. They might have been master weavers, knowing complex patterns and dyeing techniques. They could have been skilled stonemasons, understanding how to construct durable buildings. They might have been herbalists, possessing knowledge of medicinal plants and their uses for treating common ailments. They could have been experienced midwives, passing down crucial techniques for childbirth and infant care. In a world without widespread written texts or formal education for the majority, These specialized skills were passed down through direct apprenticeship and oral instruction. The sudden death of the skilled elder meant that their unique craft or trade could vanish entirely from a community, leaving a void that was difficult to fill. Furthermore, elders were the living historians of their communities. They remembered stories of past events, local legends, family genealogies, and the precedents for local laws and customs. They were the ones who could recount tales of their ancestors, explaining traditions and helping to forge a sense of continuity and shared identity. In a time when literacy was limited to a small elite, this oral history was crucial for understanding the past and navigating the present. When these storytellers and memory keepers died, an immense portion of the collective memory of a village or region was lost. This created a generation gap, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of shared understanding and cultural heritage. Survivors might have felt adrift, disconnected from their past, struggling to understand the customs and traditions that their elders had embodied. The impact was also felt in governance and social order. Elders often served as informal judges, mediators, and advisors, drawing upon their long experience and knowledge of community norms to resolve disputes. Their wisdom was respected, and their presence provided a sense of stability and continuity. Their sudden absence left communities without their traditional moral compass and guidance, potentially leading to increased social instability and difficulty in maintaining order. The informal networks of wisdom and authority that had been built over centuries were suddenly broken. The sheer scale of the democratic collapse meant that there was no time to train new elders or to consciously transfer knowledge. The world after the plague was not just smaller in population. It was also, in many ways, less knowledgeable, struggling to rebuild with fragmented memories and lost skills. The long-term effects of this intellectual void would ripple through medieval society for generations, forcing communities to relearn or invent anew what had once been common knowledge. Number 7. Social isolation and abandonment. The Black Death instilled a deep primal fear of contagion that fractured the social bonds of medieval communities, leading to widespread isolation and abandonment, particularly for the elderly. In an era when the cause of the plague was unknown and its spread seemed arbitrary and terrifying, people often resorted to extreme measures to protect themselves, even if it meant forsaking their own kin. This desperate self-preservation often left the elderly, who were often less mobile and more vulnerable, to die alone. As the plague ravaged villages and towns, fear became a potent force. The sight of neighbors and family members succumbing rapidly to the disease led many to believe that proximity to the sick was a death sentence. This belief, while understandable, fueled a devastating trend: the abandonment of the ill. If an elderly parent or grandparent fell sick, healthy family members, in a desperate attempt to save themselves, might flee the home, leaving the afflicted individual to fend for themselves. This was not necessarily an act of malice, but a desperate act of fear. The instinct for survival often overrode familial duty. Chronicles from the time speak of children leaving their dying parents and spouses deserting their sick partners. For the elderly, already dependent on others for daily care, this abandonment meant a terrifying end, alone and without comfort. Even if an elder did not immediately contract the plague, they could still face profound isolation. As people fled affected areas, those who were too frail or immobile to travel were left behind. Entire villages could become ghost towns, with the elderly, the bedridden, and the very young being the last ones remaining, trapped in silent, empty homes. They might watch from their windows as carts carried away the dead, and then as the last healthy neighbors departed, leaving only a chilling silence. The fear of contagion also meant that even if some community members remained, they might avoid contact with the elderly, believing them to be more susceptible or already carrying the disease. The traditional visits from neighbors, The shared meals, the conversations over the fence, all ceased, replaced by a pervasive dread that kept people apart. This widespread isolation was not just about physical distance. It was about the breakdown of human connection. The medieval world was a communal one. Life revolved around close-knit families, village gatherings, and religious services. The plague shattered these fundamental aspects of existence. For an elder who had lived their entire life surrounded by the familiar faces and rhythms of their community, this sudden severance of all social ties would have been a profound psychological shock. To be left alone in a dying village, with no one to talk to, no one to offer comfort, and no one to provide basic necessities, was a fate worse than many physical ailments. The lack of proper burial was another grim consequence of this isolation. In medieval society, death was a communal event, marked by rituals and attended by family and friends. The plague often made these customs impossible. The dead were simply too numerous, and the living too few or too fearful. Many elders who died alone would have simply decomposed in their homes undiscovered until much later, if at all. This denial of a proper Christian burial, a deeply important aspect of medieval belief, would have been a source of spiritual anguish for those who contemplated such a fate. The accounts of individuals being abandoned by their own families, of bodies lying unburied in homes, and of the profound silence that descended upon previously bustling communities paint a harrowing picture of the social landscape during the Black Death. For the elderly, who had lived their lives embedded within these social structures, their dismantling meant not just physical hardship, but an end to their very sense of belonging and dignity. Their final days, if they survived the initial wave of the disease, were often marked by a terrifying solitude, a silent testament to the extreme social fragmentation wrought by the plague. Number 8. Physical limitations and lack of mobility. For medieval elders, the physical limitations inherent in aging became a critical disadvantage during the Black Death, severely impacting their ability to escape the plague or even cope with its immediate aftermath. In an era when travel was arduous and daily life required considerable physical effort, a decline in mobility often sealed an elder's fate. The very structure of medieval society, largely static and tied to the land, offered little recourse for those who could not move. When news of the plague's arrival spread, often through neighboring villages or by fleeing travelers, one of the primary responses for those who could afford it and were able to was to flee. Wealthier individuals might retreat to isolated country estates, while others might attempt to move to less affected regions. This strategy, however, was rarely an option for the elderly. Long-distance travel in the medieval period was a grueling undertaking. It involved walking for miles each day, often on rough, unpaved roads, enduring harsh weather, and carrying one's possessions. An elder suffering from arthritis, failing eyesight, or general weakness would find such a journey impossible. They simply lacked the physical stamina and endurance required to outrun the plague. Consider an elderly woman living in a bustling town that suddenly becomes a hotspot for infection. Her children, younger and stronger, might gather their meager belongings and attempt to escape to the countryside. But what of her? If she relied on a walking stick or suffered from a chronic respiratory ailment that left her breathless, even a short journey to the edge of town could be an insurmountable obstacle. She would be left behind, trapped in an increasingly dangerous environment, watching as the healthy fled and the sick succumbed around her. Her lack of mobility became a chain binding her to the plague-ridden location. Even within a village, a lack of mobility posed severe risks. If an elder became bedridden, perhaps from a fall or a lingering illness common in old age, their survival depended entirely on the continued presence and health of caregivers. If these caregivers died or fled, the elder was left completely helpless. They could not fetch water, prepare food, or even relieve themselves. A simple illness or a minor injury that would normally be manageable could become fatal due to the inability to move and access basic necessities. The plague often struck swiftly, and for those who were already confined to their beds or homes, escape from direct contagion was impossible. They were sitting targets, trapped in their own living spaces. Furthermore, the physical labor involved in basic survival in medieval times was immense. Gathering firewood, tending to a small garden plot, drawing water from a well, or even simply moving around a poorly lit, cramped dwelling, all required a certain level of physical capability. For an elder whose strength was waning, these daily tasks became increasingly difficult. If the plague then arrived and their usual helpers were gone, the very acts of survival became insurmountable challenges. They might slowly starve or die of thirst, not directly from the plague itself, but from the inability to perform the basic functions necessary to sustain life in a world where assistance was no longer available. The absence of wheeled transportation for the common person meant that physical limitations translated directly into being rooted to a spot. There were no ambulances, no emergency services, and certainly no organized evacuations for the frail. If a medieval elder could not walk, they could not escape. This stark reality meant that those who were already vulnerable due to their age and infirmity were disproportionately exposed to the full brunt of the plague, with no means of retreating from its devastating reach. Their physical decline, a natural part of the human life cycle, became a fatal handicap in the face of such a catastrophic and fast-moving pandemic. Number 9. Higher mortality rates in specific communities' settings. The Black Death created death traps out of many communities, but for medieval elders, certain specific settings proved to be particularly deadly, leading to exceptionally high mortality rates. These were places designed to provide care, spiritual contemplation, or communal living. But in the face of the plague, their very nature turned them into centers of contagion and death. These specific communities include monasteries, convents, almshouses, and early hospitals, which often housed a significant proportion of the elderly population. Monasteries and convents, for example, were often places where individuals would retire in their later years, seeking spiritual solace and a structured environment. These institutions provided shelter, food, and a sense of community for both active religious members and lay associates. However, the close proximity of residents within these enclosed spaces, the shared living quarters, refectories, and chapels, created an ideal environment for the rapid spread of airborne diseases, like the pneumonic form of the plague, or for flea-borne transmission of the bubonic form. Once the plague entered a monastery, it could sweep through the entire community with devastating speed. Historical chronicles from various monastic orders detail the catastrophic losses. Many abbeys and priories reported that a large percentage, sometimes over 90%, of their monks or nuns died. For example, the Abbey of Westminster saw a significant loss of its brethren. The very rules of monastic life, which encouraged communal gathering for prayers and meals, inadvertently facilitated the plague's spread. Elders within these communities, often more frail than their younger counterparts, would have been particularly susceptible. The loss of so many members not only ended the lives of these elders, but also shattered the institutions themselves, leading to a profound loss of spiritual and intellectual life that had been sustained for centuries. These were places of learning and record-keeping, and the death of so many older, experienced scribes and scholars meant that valuable knowledge and history were simply erased. Almshouses, charitable institutions designed to provide housing and care for the elderly poor, also became death traps. These were often crowded, with residents living in close quarters and sharing facilities. The very purpose of an almshouse was to gather vulnerable individuals who could no longer care for themselves. When the plague arrived, these residents, already frail and often suffering from poor nutrition or existing ailments, had little chance of survival. The staff of these almshouses, often volunteers or low-wage workers, would also succumb, leaving the elderly residents completely abandoned and dying in their beds. The goal of providing care inadvertently concentrated vulnerability, turning places of solace into sites of mass mortality. Early hospitals, though not hospitals in the modern sense, also housed many elderly and infirm individuals. These institutions were primarily places of care for the poor, the sick, and the destitute, rather than places for healing. They often provided basic shelter and nourishment for those who had nowhere else to go. Like almshouses, these environments were often crowded and lacked proper sanitation, making them ripe for disease transmission. An elderly person admitted to such a hospital for a chronic ailment, hoping for comfort in their final years, would instead find themselves in a highly contagious environment where the plague could spread without hindrance. The very communal nature of these institutions, which was meant to provide support, became their undoing during the pandemic. These institutional settings effectively concentrated the elderly and vulnerable, making them easy targets for the plague. The shared air, the close living spaces, and the limited ability to quarantine or escape meant that once the disease gained a foothold, it spread through these populations with terrifying efficiency. The specific circumstances of communal living, combined with the general susceptibility of the elderly, created a particularly lethal combination, leading to some of the highest mortality rates recorded for any segment of the population during the Black Death.